The summer heat of July 1976 pressed down on Washington, D.C. like a heavy blanket, but inside the newly constructed National Air and Space Museum, the air conditioning hummed with reassuring efficiency. Harold Mitchell adjusted his camera strap and wiped the sweat from his forehead as he navigated through the throngs of visitors who had come to witness history in the making. "Can you believe it, Harold?" Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell appeared at his elbow, her voice filled with the kind of excitement that made her seem younger than her 42 years. The museum's head curator had been working toward this day for nearly a decade, and it showed in every animated gesture she made. 10 years of planning, and here we are, the largest air and space museum in the world, right here in our nation's capital. Harold nodded, raising his Nikon F2 to capture a shot of families gathered around the Wright Flyer exhibit. The afternoon light streaming through the museum's massive windows created perfect conditions for documentation photography. "It's something else, Elizabeth. Never seen crowds like this for a museum opening." The photographer had been documenting the Smithsonian's various projects for 15 years, but nothing compared to the energy surrounding today's grand opening. Everywhere he looked, children pressed their faces against display cases, while parents read plaques aloud, their voices mixing with the general din of amazement and discovery. "Make sure you get plenty of shots of the flight suit collection," Dr. Hartwell instructed, consulting her clipboard. "The board wants comprehensive documentation of every major exhibit for the archives. And Harold," she paused, her expression becoming more serious, "be thorough. This is history we're recording." Harold made his way toward the aviation history wing, his practiced eyes scanning for the perfect angles and lighting conditions. The museum's designers had done exceptional work, creating an atmosphere that felt both educational and inspiring. Interactive displays encouraged hands-on learning, while carefully preserved artifacts told the story of humanity's conquest of the skies. The flight suit exhibit occupied a prominent position near the center of the wing, housed within climate-controlled glass cases that reflected the museum's commitment to preservation. Harold studied the collection through his viewfinder, noting how the suit seemed to trace an evolutionary line from the leather and canvas of early aviators to the sophisticated designs worn by the Apollo astronauts. "Excuse me, sir," a young voice interrupted his concentration. Harold lowered his camera to find a security guard, probably no more than 25, approaching with a concerned expression. The man's nameplate read Thompson, and his uniform still bore the crisp creases of recent pressing. "Is there a problem, Officer Thompson?" "Well, sir, I'm not entirely sure." Thompson glanced toward the flight suit display, then back at Harold. "I've been watching that exhibit for the past hour, and I keep seeing this kid, maybe 8 or 9 years old. Thing is, he seems to be inside the case somehow." Harold followed the guard's gaze to the sealed display. Through the spotless glass, he could see the carefully arranged flight suits, each mounted on invisible supports that made them appear to float in space. The lighting was perfect, the presentation flawless. "I don't see any child," Harold said, adjusting his glasses. "That's just it," Thompson replied, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "He's not always there. But when he is, it's like he belongs there, like he's part of the exhibit. The other visitors don't seem to notice him at all." Harold studied the young guard's face, searching for signs of fatigue or stress. Opening day had been challenging for everyone, and the security staff had been working double shifts to handle the unprecedented crowds. "Maybe you should take a break," Harold suggested kindly. "Get some water. Sit down for a few minutes. This heat can play tricks on anyone." Thompson nodded reluctantly, but his eyes remained fixed on the display case. "Yeah, maybe you're right. It's just, if you see anything unusual, would you let me know?" As the guard walked away, Harold raised his camera once more. Through the viewfinder, the flight suit exhibit appeared exactly as it should. A pristine display of aviation history, carefully curated and professionally presented. He adjusted his focus, checked his exposure settings, and pressed the shutter. The camera's mirror flapped up and down with its familiar mechanical precision, capturing what would become one of thousands of photographs taken that day. Harold advanced the film, made a note in his logbook, and moved on to the next exhibit, unaware that he had just documented something that would change everything he thought he knew about reality itself. The afternoon continued with the methodical rhythm of professional photography: compose, focus, shoot, advance. Harold worked his way through every major exhibit, capturing the wonder on visitors' faces and the magnificence of humanity's greatest technological achievements. As closing time approached and the crowds began to thin, Harold found himself back near the flight suit display. The late afternoon light had shifted, casting longer shadows through the museum's windows. In the relative quiet, he could hear the gentle hum of the climate control systems and the distant echo of footsteps on polished floors. Something made him raise his camera one more time, pointing it toward the same display he had photographed hours earlier. Through the viewfinder, everything looked identical to his morning shots. The same carefully arranged suits, the same professional lighting, the same spotless glass. But as his finger found the shutter button, Harold could have sworn he saw something move within the case. A shadow, perhaps, or a reflection from somewhere else in the museum. He held his breath, steadied his hands, and captured one final frame before the day was done. 3 weeks later, Harold Mitchell stood in his home darkroom, the familiar scent of developer and fixer chemicals filling the small basement space he had converted years earlier. Red light bathed everything in an otherworldly glow as he carefully lifted a strip of negatives from the developing tank, holding it up to examine the frames against the safety light. The opening day shots had been processed in batches, and this particular roll contained his documentation of the flight suit exhibit. Harold had developed thousands of photographs over his career, and the routine had become almost meditative. The precise timing, the careful temperature control, the gradual emergence of images from blank film. But as he examined this strip more closely, his practiced eye caught something that made him pause. "That's odd," he murmured to himself, reaching for his magnifying loupe. Through the magnifier, the anomaly became more distinct. In what should have been an empty display case containing only flight suits, there appeared to be the silhouette of a small figure. Harold moved to his enlarger, carefully positioning the negative in the carrier and adjusting the focus. As the image projected onto the photographic paper became sharp, Harold's breath caught in his throat. There, standing clearly within the sealed display case, was a young boy. The child appeared to be about 8 years old, wearing modern clothes that seemed distinctly out of place among the historical aviation artifacts. Blue jeans, a t-shirt with some kind of logo, and sneakers that looked more advanced than anything Harold had seen in 1976. The boy's face was turned slightly toward the camera, and his expression held an unsettling mixture of sadness and knowledge that seemed far too mature for his apparent age. Most disturbing of all, he appeared completely solid and real, casting shadows on the exhibit backdrop, despite standing inside what Harold knew to be a sealed, climate-controlled case. Harold's hands trembled slightly as he made the exposure, his mind racing through possible explanations. Double exposure was the most logical answer, but he was meticulous about rewinding film completely and had never experienced such an error in 15 years of professional photography. Equipment malfunction seemed unlikely given the precision of his other shots from that day. As the paper developed in the chemical baths, the image became increasingly clear and undeniable. The boy was definitely there, definitely inside the case, and definitely not part of any planned exhibit. Harold made several prints at different exposures, hoping to find some evidence that would explain the anomaly. But each print showed the same impossible scene: a child who shouldn't exist, standing in a place he couldn't possibly access, wearing clothes from a time that didn't match the historical period of the exhibit. The photographer moved to his filing cabinet and pulled out his contact sheets from that day, spreading them across his work table under the enlarger light. As he examined frame after frame with his magnifying glass, his confusion deepened into something approaching fear. The boy appeared in multiple shots throughout the museum, always in different locations, but always near exhibits that somehow seemed wrong. In one frame, he stood beside a space capsule that Harold was certain hadn't been part of the collection during his tour. In another, he appeared to be examining an aircraft that looked far too advanced for the museum's historical timeline. Most unsettling was a shot Harold had taken near the end of the day, showing a wide view of the main gallery. In the background, barely visible without magnification, the boy could be seen standing near what appeared to be a display case containing a flight suit that Harold didn't remember seeing during his documentation. According to Harold's notes, that particular case had housed an early 1960s pressure suit worn by test pilots, but in the photograph, the suit appeared sleeker, more technologically advanced, with design elements that seemed decades ahead of anything that should have existed in 1976. Harold sat back in his darkroom chair, staring at the prints spread before him. His rational mind searched for explanations. Maybe the museum had changed some exhibits between his initial tour and the photography session. Maybe his memory was faulty. Maybe the stress of documenting such an important event had caused him to overlook details. But none of these explanations could account for the boy himself. Harold had photographed thousands of people over the years, and he knew the difference between a person and a photographic artifact. This child was real, substantial, and present in ways that defied every logical explanation. The photographer gathered his prints and negatives, his movements careful and deliberate despite the tremor in his hands. Tomorrow, he would need to contact Dr. Hartwell. As the museum's head curator, she would need to know that something very strange had occurred during the opening day documentation. But as Harold climbed the stairs from his darkroom, leaving the red-lit world of chemical development behind, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had stumbled onto something far more significant than a simple photographic error. The boy's eyes, captured in silver halide crystals and chemical emulsion, seemed to hold secrets that Harold wasn't sure he was prepared to understand. In his living room, Harold spread the prints on his coffee table under the warm light of a table lamp. In normal lighting, away from the darkroom's red glow, the images became even more disturbing. The boy's modern clothing stood in stark contrast to the 1970s visitors surrounding him, and his presence in impossible locations suggested something that challenged Harold's understanding of reality itself. The photographer reached for his phone, then hesitated. How do you call a respected museum curator and explain that you've photographed what appears to be a time-displaced child? How do you present evidence of something that shouldn't exist without sounding like you've lost your professional credibility? Harold looked at the photographs once more, studying the boy's face with growing certainty that this was no mistake, no error, no trick of light and shadow. This was something real, something important, and something that demanded investigation regardless of how impossible it seemed. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell sat in her office on the third floor of the National Air and Space Museum, surrounded by the controlled chaos that came with managing one of the world's most ambitious cultural institutions. Shipping manifests, acquisition reports, and visitor feedback forms covered every available surface, but her attention was focused entirely on the manila envelope Harold Mitchell had delivered an hour earlier. The photographs lay spread across her desk, like evidence in a criminal investigation. Elizabeth had examined each print multiple times, using the magnifying glass she normally reserved for authentication work on historical artifacts. No matter how she studied them, the conclusion remained the same. Somehow, impossibly, a young boy had been photographed inside sealed exhibit cases throughout her museum. "This has to be a mistake," she murmured, though her voice lacked conviction. Elizabeth had known Harold for over a decade, and his reputation for precision and reliability was unquestioned. He had documented everything from presidential visits to delicate restoration work, always with meticulous attention to detail. If Harold said these photographs were authentic and unmanipulated, she believed him. But belief didn't make the images any less impossible. The boy appeared in 7 different photographs taken throughout the opening day. In each image, he seemed to be studying the exhibits with an intensity that was unusual for a child his age. His clothing was anachronistic in ways that made Elizabeth's trained historian's eye uncomfortable. The fabric weaves were too perfect, the colors too vibrant, the cut of his jeans too modern for 1976. More disturbing were the exhibits themselves. In several photographs, Elizabeth could see displays that didn't match her carefully maintained records. The flight suit collection, in particular, showed equipment that she was certain hadn't been part of the opening day presentation. Elizabeth reached for her phone and dialed the museum's security office. "This is Dr. Hartwell. Could you send Officer Thompson up to my office, please? I need to speak with him about something from opening day." While she waited, Elizabeth consulted her master catalogue of the museum's collections. Every artifact was meticulously documented, photographed, and tracked through a system she had personally developed. According to her records, the flight suit exhibit contained 12 historically significant pieces, ranging from early aviator leather jackets to Apollo-era pressure suits. But in Harold's photographs, she could clearly see what appeared to be a 13th suit, a sleek silver garment with design elements that looked decades more advanced than anything in their collection. The suit seemed to shimmer in the museum's lighting, and its helmet design incorporated features that Elizabeth had never seen in any historical aviation equipment. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in." Officer Thompson entered, looking slightly nervous. At 25, he was one of the museum's youngest security guards, but Elizabeth had noted his attention to detail and genuine enthusiasm for the exhibits. "You wanted to see me, Dr. Hartwell? Please sit down." Elizabeth gestured to the chair across from her desk. "I want to ask you about something you mentioned to Harold Mitchell on opening day. Something about seeing a child in the exhibits? Thompson's expression became wary. I'm not sure what you mean, ma'am. Harold told me you reported seeing a boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old, inside one of the display cases, specifically the flight suit exhibit. The young guard shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I thought maybe I was seeing things. The heat, the crowds, working double shift, it seemed impossible. Elizabeth leaned forward, her voice gentle but insistent. Tell me exactly what you saw. Thompson took a deep breath. At first, I thought it was a reflection or maybe someone standing behind the case, but the more I watched, the more certain I became that there was actually a kid inside the display. He looked real, solid, like he belonged there. But that's impossible, right? Those cases are sealed, climate-controlled, monitored constantly. Did you report this to anyone else? No, ma'am. Like I said, it seemed impossible, and none of the other visitors seemed to notice anything unusual. They just walked past like everything was normal. Elizabeth nodded slowly. Did you see this child anywhere else in the museum? Thompson considered the question carefully. Maybe. There were a few times during the day when I thought I glimpsed someone who shouldn't have been in restricted areas. Near the storage rooms, by the staff elevators. But every time I looked directly, there was nobody there. Can you describe what the boy looked like? Young, maybe 8 years old, dark hair. He was wearing regular clothes, not period costume or anything special. Jeans, I think, and a t-shirt. What struck me most was his expression. He looked sad maybe, or worried about something. Like he knew something the rest of us didn't. Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. Thompson's description matched exactly what Harold had captured in the photographs. Officer Thompson, I want you to know that I take your observations seriously. You're trained to notice details and your instincts are valuable. If you see anything else unusual, anything at all, I want you to report it directly to me. Understood? Yes, ma'am. But Doctor Hartwell, can I ask what this is about? Elizabeth looked down at the photographs spread across her desk, then back at the young security guard. I'm not entirely sure yet, but I think we may have a situation that requires careful investigation. After Thompson left, Elizabeth locked her office door and returned to the photographs. She pulled out a detailed floor plan of the museum and began marking the locations where the boy had appeared. A pattern emerged that made her increasingly uncomfortable. The child seemed to be following a specific route through the museum, visiting exhibits in a sequence that corresponded to the chronological development of aviation technology. But he was also appearing near displays that shouldn't have existed, examining equipment that hadn't been invented yet. Elizabeth reached for her secure phone line and dialed a number she rarely used. Dr. Peterson, this is Elizabeth Hartwell at Air and Space. I need to speak with you about something unusual, something that might require your particular expertise. Dr. Marcus Peterson was a physicist at Georgetown University who consulted occasionally for the Smithsonian on matters involving advanced technology and unexplained phenomena. If anyone could help her understand what was happening in her museum, it would be him. Elizabeth, good to hear from you. What's got you puzzled? Marcus, I have some photographs I'd like you to examine. They show something that shouldn't be possible, and I need someone with your background to help me understand what we might be dealing with. There was a pause on the other end of the line. How impossible are we talking about? Elizabeth looked at the image of the boy standing impossibly inside a sealed display case, his young face holding secrets that seemed to span decades. Marcus, I think we might be dealing with something that challenges our understanding of time itself. Dr. Marcus Peterson arrived at the National Air and Space Museum after hours, when the building was closed to the public and the exhibit stood in relative darkness. Elizabeth met him at the staff entrance, her face showing the strain of 3 sleepless nights since Harold's photographs had upended her understanding of her own museum. Thank you for coming so late, she said, as they walked through the eerily quiet corridors. I didn't want to risk anyone else seeing these images until we understand what we're dealing with. Marcus carried a leather briefcase containing various analytical equipment he used for consulting work. At 58, he had spent decades studying phenomena that existed at the edges of accepted physics, and his reputation for discretion made him valuable to institutions that encountered unexplainable situations. You've certainly got my curiosity up, he said as they took the elevator to Elizabeth's office. In 30 years of consulting, I've never heard you sound quite this unsettled. Elizabeth unlocked her office and spread Harold's photographs across a large conference table under bright fluorescent lights. Marcus approached the images methodically, pulling on white cotton gloves before handling the prints. Tell me about the circumstances, he said, studying the first photograph through a magnifying lens. When were these taken, by whom, and under what conditions. Elizabeth provided a detailed account of the museum's opening day, Harold's photography work, and the subsequent development process. Marcus listened without interruption, occasionally making notes in a small notebook. "And you've verified the photographer's credibility. Harold Mitchell has been documenting Smithsonian events for 15 years. He's never had a single incident of questionable work. His equipment is professional grade, well-maintained, and he follows strict protocols for handling and processing film." Marcus moved to the second photograph, this one showing the boy standing near what appeared to be an aircraft exhibit. "This aircraft in the background, is it part of your collection?" Elizabeth had been dreading this question. "That's part of what makes this so troubling. According to my records, we don't have any aircraft matching that configuration. The design elements are too advanced for anything that should exist in 1976. Too advanced how? The wing structure, the materials, the apparent propulsion system. It looks more like something from a theoretical aerospace journal than an actual aircraft. And yet there it is, photographed as if it's a normal part of our collection." Marcus pulled out a small device that looked like a specialized magnifying glass with electronic components. "This is a digital densitometer. It measures the optical density of different areas in a photograph, which can help identify manipulation or composite images." He spent 20 minutes examining each photograph methodically, taking measurements and making detailed notes. Elizabeth watched nervously, hoping for an explanation that would restore her faith in rational reality. "The density measurements are consistent throughout each image," Marcus finally announced. "If these are composite photographs, they're beyond anything technically possible in 1976. The lighting, shadows, and grain structure all indicate these are single-exposure photographs of real events." Elizabeth's heart sank. So the boy is really there. The boy is definitely in the photographs, and the photographs appear to be authentic documentation of whatever was in front of the camera when these exposures were made. Marcus moved to the photograph showing the boy inside the flight suit display case. "This particular image is the most troubling from a physics standpoint. You're certain this case was sealed during the opening day?" "Absolutely. Climate-controlled, alarmed, and monitored constantly. There's no way anyone could have accessed the interior without triggering multiple security systems. And yet, here's a child standing inside, apparently solid and three-dimensional, casting shadows consistent with the exhibit lighting." Marcus sat down heavily in one of Elizabeth's chairs, studying his notes. "Elizabeth, I need to ask you some questions that might seem strange, but I want you to answer honestly. Has anyone reported unusual electromagnetic readings in the museum? Unexplained temperature fluctuations? Electronic equipment malfunctioning?" Elizabeth thought carefully. "Now that you mention it, we've had several incidents with the climate control systems since opening day. Temperature sensors giving inconsistent readings, humidity controls cycling unpredictably. Our electronics technicians said it was probably just new building settling issues." "What about the staff? Anyone reporting unusual experiences, seeing things, hearing sounds that don't have obvious sources?" Officer Thompson saw the boy directly, not just in photographs, and there have been a few reports from night security about sounds in the exhibits after hours. Footsteps, voices, that sort of thing. We attributed it to the building settling or acoustic effects from the ventilation systems. Marcus was quiet for several minutes, studying the photographs and his measurements. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "Elizabeth, based on what I'm seeing here, I believe your museum may be experiencing what we might call temporal displacement phenomena. The boy in these photographs appears to be from a different time period than 1976, and the exhibits he's examining seem to represent technology from various future timelines. That's impossible. Is it more impossible than a child appearing inside sealed display cases?" Elizabeth had no answer for that. Marcus continued, "There are theoretical frameworks in physics that allow for temporal anomalies under extremely specific conditions, usually involving massive energy fields, exotic matter, or quantum effects we don't fully understand. Has there been any unusual construction work around the museum? Any new technology installations?" The museum was built on the site of some old government facilities. There were extensive excavations, and we did encounter some unusual underground structures that had to be removed. The construction crews mentioned finding rooms and equipment that didn't match the historical records for the site. "What kind of equipment?" "I don't know the details. The construction supervisor said it looked like some kind of research facility, probably from the 1950s. Everything was cleared out and documented by government archaeologists before we could examine it properly. Marcus made more notes, his expression growing increasingly concerned. Elizabeth, I think you need to contact those archaeologists and get copies of their documentation. I also think you need to prepare for the possibility that what's happening in your museum is just the beginning. The beginning of what? Marcus looked at the photographs one more time, focusing on the boy's face with its expression of knowledge and sadness. The beginning of something that could change everything we understand about time, causality, and the nature of reality itself. And based on the expression on this child's face, I don't think the changes are going to be pleasant. Elizabeth stood in the basement archives of the Smithsonian's administrative building at dawn, surrounded by boxes of construction documents dating back to the museum's groundbreaking in 1972. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as she searched through blueprints, archaeological reports, and government correspondence that had been gathering dust for 4 years. Dr. Peterson had insisted that understanding the museum's foundation might be key to explaining the temporal anomalies, and Elizabeth had spent the entire night tracking down every document related to the site's excavation and construction. What she found made her increasingly uncomfortable. The original site had indeed housed a government research facility, but the documentation was heavily redacted and classified at levels that seemed excessive for a simple historical preservation project. Multiple agencies had been involved in the excavation: the Army Corps of Engineers, the Department of Energy, and several organizations whose acronyms Elizabeth didn't recognize. Dr. Hartwell? Harold Mitchell's voice interrupted her research. She had asked him to meet her early to review more of his opening day photographs. Harold, thank you for coming. I've been going through the construction records, and I think we need to take a much closer look at everything you photographed that day. Harold set down a new manila envelope containing additional prints he had made during the night. I've been thinking about what you and Dr. Peterson discussed yesterday. I went back through all my contact sheets and found more images of the boy. Elizabeth, he appears in 23 different photographs taken throughout the day. Elizabeth opened the envelope with trembling hands. The new prints showed the mysterious child in locations throughout the museum, always near exhibits that seemed somehow wrong or out of place. In several images, he appeared to be interacting with displays in ways that should have been impossible. Look at this one, Harold said, pointing to a photograph taken in the Space Exploration Wing. He's standing next to what appears to be a mission control console, but look at the technology. Those screens, the interface design, the overall configuration, it's more advanced than anything NASA was using in 1976. Elizabeth studied the image through her magnifying glass. Harold was right. The console looked like something from science fiction, with sleek displays and control interfaces that wouldn't be developed for decades. And here, Harold continued, indicating another photograph, this shows him near what should be our lunar module display. But look at the craft in the background. The design is completely different from the actual lunar module we have on exhibit. Elizabeth compared the photograph to her master catalogue. According to her records, the lunar module display contained an authentic training replica from the Apollo program. But the craft in Harold's photograph showed design elements that were far more sophisticated than anything from the 1960s space program. Harold, I need you to help me with something that might sound unusual. I want you to photograph the museum again today, before we open to the public. I want documentation of every exhibit exactly as it exists right now, to compare with the opening day shots? Exactly. I have a theory, and I hope I'm wrong. They made their way to the museum through the early morning Washington streets. The summer air was already heavy with humidity, promising another sweltering day. Inside the museum, the exhibit stood in pre-opening quiet, illuminated only by emergency lighting and the natural light filtering through the building's massive windows. Harold began his systematic documentation while Elizabeth consulted her detailed floor plans and exhibit catalogues. What she discovered confirmed her worst fears. The flight suit exhibit that had been the focus of the temporal anomaly contained exactly 12 historically accurate pieces, just as her records indicated. But in Harold's opening day photographs, 13 suits were clearly visible, including the impossibly advanced silver garment that seemed to shimmer with its own inner light. The Space Exploration Wing showed similar discrepancies. The mission control console that appeared in Harold's photographs didn't exist in the current exhibits. The lunar module display contained only the authentic Apollo-era replica, not the advanced craft that had appeared in the temporal images. "Elizabeth," Harold called from across the gallery, "you need to see this. She found him standing in front of a display case that should have contained early aviation instruments. According to the morning's photographs, the case held exactly what her catalogue indicated: altimeters, airspeed indicators, and navigation equipment from the 1920s and 1930s. But Harold was staring at something else entirely. "It's happening again," he whispered. Through the glass of the display case, Elizabeth could see the familiar figure of the 8-year-old boy. He stood among the aviation instruments, but now he wasn't alone. The case contained equipment that didn't belong there: sophisticated electronic devices with digital displays, navigation systems that looked decades more advanced than anything in their collection. As Elizabeth watched in amazement and growing terror, the boy turned to look directly at her. His eyes held an expression of urgency and warning that made her blood run cold. He raised one small hand and pressed it against the inside of the glass, and for a moment Elizabeth could have sworn she heard a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "It's starting again." The words were barely audible, more felt than heard, but their meaning was unmistakable. The boy was trying to warn them about something that was beginning to happen, something that involved the museum, the temporal anomalies, and the advanced technology that kept appearing in impossible places. Harold raised his camera and began taking photographs, his professional instincts overriding his shock. "Elizabeth, the exhibits are changing while we watch. Look at the space wing." Elizabeth turned to see displays throughout the museum, flickering like television screens with poor reception. Exhibits would show their normal historical contents for a few seconds, then shift to reveal advanced technology that shouldn't exist, then return to normal again. "The construction documents," Elizabeth said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Harold, whatever they found underground when they built this museum, it's not dormant anymore. The opening day somehow activated something, and now it's getting stronger." The boy in the display case pressed both hands against the glass now, his expression becoming more desperate. The advanced equipment around him grew more solid and distinct, while the historical aviation instruments began to fade like ghosts. Elizabeth realized with growing horror that they weren't just witnessing temporal anomalies. They were watching the past and future collide in ways that could fundamentally alter the nature of reality itself, and the boy was trapped in the middle of it, trying to warn them before it was too late. The museum's main gallery had become a theater of impossible transformations. Elizabeth watched in horror as display cases throughout the building flickered between different versions of reality like broken television screens. Historical artifacts would appear solid and normal for moments at a time, then fade to reveal advanced technology that shouldn't exist for decades. Harold continued photographing frantically, his camera capturing images that defied everything they understood about time and space. "Elizabeth, look at the visitor information desk." Where moments before there had been simple 1976-era displays about museum hours and exhibits, now there appeared to be sophisticated holographic projections showing three-dimensional models of aircraft that looked like they belonged in science fiction films. The holographs flickered and stabilized, then faded back to reveal the familiar paper brochures and wooden information stands. "This is accelerating," Elizabeth said, consulting her watch. "The transformations are happening more frequently, lasting longer each time." The boy in the aviation instruments display case had become more solid and distinct, his presence no longer seeming like a photographic anomaly, but rather like a desperate messenger trying to communicate across impossible barriers of time and space. His mouth moved as if he were speaking, but the words remained inaudible through the sealed glass. Elizabeth approached the case cautiously. "Can you hear me?" she asked, feeling foolish but driven by growing desperation. The boy nodded vigorously, then pointed to something behind Elizabeth. She turned to see that the museum's central information kiosk had transformed into what appeared to be a sophisticated computer terminal, with displays showing technical schematics and data streams that scrolled too quickly to read. Harold lowered his camera. "Elizabeth, those schematics, they look like blueprints for some kind of time manipulation device." Elizabeth studied the flickering displays. The technical drawings showed complex machinery with components that seemed to blend advanced electronics with exotic materials. Energy flow diagrams indicated power requirements that dwarfed anything available with 1976 technology. "Harold, I think that's exactly what they are." The boy in the display case became more agitated, pressing his face against the glass and gesturing frantically toward the basement levels of the museum. His expression held a mixture of fear and urgency that made Elizabeth's heart race. "He wants us to go downstairs," she realized. "He's trying to show us something in the basement. Dr. Hartwell, I'm not sure that's wise. If these temporal effects are getting stronger, going deeper into the building might be dangerous." Elizabeth looked around the gallery, watching as more exhibits transformed into advanced technology that flickered in and out of existence. The boy was right. Whatever was happening was centered in the museum itself, and the source was likely in the foundation levels, where the mysterious government research facility had once operated. "Harold, we may not have a choice. If this continues to accelerate, it could affect more than just our museum. The boy is trying to warn us about something, and I think we need to understand what we're dealing with before it's too late." They made their way to the service elevator that provided access to the museum's basement levels. As the elevator descended, the temperature dropped noticeably, and Elizabeth could hear strange humming sounds that seemed to come from the building's infrastructure itself. The basement level they reached was supposed to contain only storage areas, climate control equipment, and utility access. But when the elevator doors opened, Elizabeth found herself looking at a corridor that didn't match any of the building's architectural plans. The walls were lined with what appeared to be sophisticated monitoring equipment, with displays showing readings that fluctuated constantly. Cables and conduits ran along the ceiling, in configurations that looked more like advanced research facilities than museum infrastructure. "This isn't supposed to exist," Elizabeth whispered. Harold raised his camera and began documenting what they were seeing. "The construction records you showed me this morning. They mentioned finding underground facilities, but this looks like it was never removed. It looks like it was integrated into the museum's foundation." As they walked down the impossible corridor, the humming sounds grew louder and more complex, creating harmonics that seemed to resonate in Elizabeth's bones. The monitoring displays showed increasingly erratic readings, with graphs and data streams that spiked and fluctuated in patterns that suggested some kind of massive energy buildup. At the end of the corridor, they found a heavy door marked with symbols that Elizabeth didn't recognize. The door stood slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of what appeared to be a large chamber filled with equipment that looked decades ahead of anything that should exist in 1976. "Harold, I think we've found the source of our temporal anomalies." Elizabeth pushed the door open carefully, revealing a circular chamber that contained what could only be described as a time manipulation device. The machinery filled the room from floor to ceiling, with components that seemed to blend advanced electronics, exotic crystalline materials, and energy conduits that pulsed with inner light. At the center of the device stood a control console that matched the schematics they had seen flickering in the museum displays above, but this console was occupied by a figure that made Elizabeth's blood freeze in her veins. It was the same boy they had been seeing throughout the museum, but older, perhaps 16 or 17 years old, wearing clothing that looked decades more advanced than anything from 1976. He stood at the controls with an expression of desperate concentration, his hands moving over interfaces that responded with cascades of light and sound. When he saw Elizabeth and Harold enter the chamber, his face showed relief mixed with terrible sadness. "Dr. Hartwell," he said, and his voice carried the weight of knowledge that spanned decades. "You're just in time. But I'm afraid what I have to tell you is going to change everything you thought you knew about your museum, about time itself, and about the price humanity will pay for its ambitions in space." Elizabeth found her voice with difficulty. "Who are you? How do you know my name? What is this place?" The older version of the boy looked at her with eyes that held far too much experience for his apparent age. "My name is David Chen, and in the timeline I come from, I was born in 2010. This device was built by the government in the 1950s as part of a classified research program into temporal manipulation. Your museum was constructed on top of it to hide its existence, but the opening day ceremonies somehow reactivated the system." Harold lowered his camera, overwhelmed by what he was hearing. "Reactivated it to do what?" David's expression became even more grave. "To prevent a catastrophic future that my timeline discovered too late to stop. The space program achievements you're celebrating in 1976 will lead to discoveries that humanity isn't ready for. Technologies that will tear holes in the fabric of time itself." Elizabeth felt the world spinning around her. "You're saying this museum, this device, it's all designed to change the future?" "Not change it," David replied, his hands continuing to work at the control console. "Prevent it from ever happening at all. But the process is dangerous, unstable, And if I can't control it properly, it won't just prevent the catastrophic future. It will unravel the timeline completely, erasing past, present, and future in ways that could destroy reality itself. The machinery around them pulsed with increasing intensity, and Elizabeth could feel the air itself vibrating with barely contained energy. "David, what do you need us to do?" David Chen's hands moved across the temporal manipulation console with practiced precision, but Elizabeth could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the chamber's cool temperature. The machinery around them hummed with increasing intensity, and the air itself seemed to shimmer with barely contained energy. "Before I explain what you need to do," David said, without looking away from his controls, "you need to understand what happens if we fail. You need to see the timeline I'm trying to prevent." He touched a series of controls, and suddenly the circular chamber was filled with three-dimensional holographic projections that showed scenes of devastating beauty and terror. Elizabeth and Harold found themselves standing in the middle of what appeared to be a historical documentary from a future that hadn't happened yet. "This begins in 1986, David explained, as the projections shifted to show what looked like a more advanced version of the Space Shuttle program. 10 years from your current time. The Challenger disaster doesn't happen because NASA develops new safety protocols based on research conducted here, in this facility, using temporal data from future timelines. The holographic scenes showed successful shuttle missions, space stations far more sophisticated than anything Elizabeth knew was being planned, and eventually permanent lunar bases established by the early 1990s. "It looks wonderful," Elizabeth said, watching scenes of human achievement that surpassed her wildest dreams. "It was at first," David replied, his voice heavy with sadness. "The space program accelerated beyond anything your timeline imagines. By 2000, humans had permanent settlements on Mars. By 2010, we were exploring the outer planets with manned missions. The projections shifted to show massive spacecraft that looked more like flying cities than anything Elizabeth recognized as human technology. The achievements were breathtaking. Colonies among the moons of Jupiter, mining operations in the asteroid belt, and exploratory missions to nearby star systems. But the success came at a price," David continued. "To achieve these advances, scientists began experimenting with exotic physics, quantum tunneling for faster-than-light communication, temporal mechanics for instantaneous travel across vast distances, and eventually, direct manipulation of space-time itself. The holographic scenes darkened, showing laboratories where experiments pushed the boundaries of reality itself. Elizabeth watched scientists working with equipment that seemed to bend space around them, creating pockets of distorted time where seconds could stretch into hours or compress into microseconds. "They called it the Kronos Project," David said, "a research program designed to make interstellar travel practical by creating controlled temporal corridors. Ships could travel between star systems by stepping outside normal space-time, covering distances that would take centuries in ordinary space." Harold, who had been silent throughout the presentation, finally spoke. "What went wrong?" David's expression became haunted. "They succeeded. In 2035, the first Kronos drive was tested. It worked perfectly, creating a stable temporal corridor that allowed instantaneous travel between Earth and Proxima Centauri. The projections showed the moment of success, a spacecraft disappearing in a burst of controlled energy, then reappearing instantly at its destination. The scientific achievement represented the culmination of humanity's greatest ambitions. But opening those corridors had consequences no one anticipated," David continued. "Each temporal tunnel created fractures in the fabric of space-time itself. Small at first, barely detectable, but they began to spread and interconnect. The holographic display showed what looked like a three-dimensional spider web of cracks spreading through space around Earth and extending outward toward the stars. The cracks grew larger and more numerous with each use of the Kronos drive technology. By 2050, the fractures had spread throughout local space. Time began to behave unpredictably. Past, present, and future started bleeding into each other. People would age decades in minutes, then reverse back to childhood. Entire cities would flicker between different time periods. Elizabeth watched in horror as the projections showed scenes of temporal chaos, buildings that existed in multiple time periods simultaneously, people trapped in temporal loops that repeated endlessly, and regions where cause and effect operated in reverse. The government realized what was happening and tried to shut down all temporal research, but it was too late. The fractures had become self-sustaining, spreading outward from Earth at the speed of light. Within a century, the temporal damage would reach other star systems, potentially destroying civilizations that had never even heard of humanity. David's voice became barely audible. In my timeline, I was part of the research team that discovered the only solution: complete temporal reset, erasing the entire timeline back to a point before humanity developed the technology that caused the catastrophe. That's why you're here, Elizabeth realized. You're not just preventing a bad future, you're erasing an entire timeline to save the universe from temporal destruction. But the process requires precise control, David explained. The temporal reset must be initiated from the exact point where the cascade began. This facility was built on a natural temporal anomaly that makes it the perfect nexus point. Your museum's opening day created the resonance frequency needed to activate the reset system. The machinery around them pulsed more intensively, and Elizabeth could feel vibrations in the floor that suggested massive energies building toward some kind of critical threshold. David, what happens to you when the reset is complete? Harold asked quietly. The young man's hands paused on the controls for just a moment. I cease to exist. Everyone from my timeline ceases to exist. The future I come from will never happen, which means I'll never be born, never travel back to this point, never initiate the reset. Elizabeth felt tears forming in her eyes. You're sacrificing your entire reality to save ours. Not just yours, David replied. I'm sacrificing my reality to save every reality. The temporal fractures would eventually spread beyond our local group of galaxies, potentially destroying every civilization in the universe. The holographic projections faded, leaving them standing in the humming chamber with its impossible machinery and the weight of cosmic responsibility. But there's a problem, David continued, and his voice carried a new note of urgency. The reset process is destabilizing faster than I anticipated. I can maintain control for maybe another hour, but after that the temporal effects will cascade beyond my ability to contain them. Elizabeth looked around the chamber, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what she was being asked to understand. What do you need us to do? David turned to face her directly, and she could see exhaustion and determination warring in his young face. I need you to help me complete the reset process. But more importantly, I need you to make sure that when your timeline moves forward from 1976, humanity never develops the technologies that lead to the Kronos project. The knowledge I'm about to give you could save the universe, but it will require you to sabotage humanity's greatest achievements in space. Elizabeth stared at David Chen, her mind reeling from the magnitude of what he was asking. Around them, the temporal machinery pulsed with increasing urgency, and she could feel the very air vibrating with barely controlled forces that could reshape reality itself. You want me to sabotage humanity's future in space, she said slowly, her voice barely audible over the humming machinery. You're asking me to prevent achievements that could represent our species' greatest triumphs. David's hands continued working at the control console, sweat now visible on his face, despite his apparent concentration. Dr. Hartwell, I understand how this sounds, but you have to understand that those achievements lead directly to the extinction of not just humanity, but potentially every intelligent species in the universe. Harold lowered his camera, overwhelmed by the scope of the conversation. How could we even do something like that? We're just museum people. We don't control space policy or scientific research. You have more influence than you realize, David replied. Dr. Hartwell, your museum will become one of the most influential institutions in shaping public opinion about space exploration. The exhibits you choose, the stories you tell, the way you present humanity's relationship with technology will influence generations of scientists, engineers, and policymakers. Elizabeth thought about the thousands of children who would visit the museum, their eyes lighting up as they learned about humanity's achievements in flight and space exploration. You want me to discourage them, to make space exploration seem dangerous or unwise. Not discourage, David said, his voice urgent. Redirect. Focus on sustainable technologies, on exploration that doesn't require manipulating the fundamental forces of space-time. Emphasize cooperation over competition, careful study over rapid advancement. The machinery around them suddenly emitted a sound like breaking glass, and several of the displays showed readings that spiked into dangerous ranges. David worked frantically at the controls, his movements becoming more desperate. We're running out of time, he said. The temporal cascade is accelerating. I need you to make a choice now, before the window closes forever. Elizabeth looked around the impossible chamber, at the technology that shouldn't exist, at the young man who was sacrificing his entire timeline to save the universe. David, what happens if we refuse? What happens if we decide that humanity deserves the chance to make its own choices, even if those choices might lead to catastrophe? David's hands stilled for a moment, and he looked at her with eyes that held decades of terrible knowledge. Then the temporal reset fails, the fractures continue spreading, and within 2 centuries, space-time itself begins to unravel, not just in our local area, but everywhere. Every star, every planet, every civilization that has ever existed or ever will exist gets caught in an expanding wave of temporal destruction. Harold stepped forward. But you could be wrong. Maybe your timeline found a solution to the temporal fractures. Maybe humanity could learn to control the Chronos technology safely. We tried, David said quietly. For 20 years, we tried everything we could think of. The best minds in human history worked on the problem. But the mathematics are unforgiving. Once you create large-scale temporal fractures, they become self-sustaining. They feed on the energy of space-time itself, growing larger and more destructive with each passing moment. The chamber shook suddenly, and Elizabeth could see cracks appearing in the walls that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. The temporal machinery was straining against forces that were beyond its ability to contain. "Dr. Hartwell," David said, his voice now carrying desperate urgency, "I can maintain the reset field for maybe 10 more minutes. After that, the cascade becomes irreversible. You have to decide now." Elizabeth closed her eyes, trying to comprehend the weight of the decision she was being asked to make: save the universe by sabotaging humanity's greatest achievements, or preserve human freedom of choice and risk the destruction of everything that had ever existed. When she opened her eyes, she found Harold watching her intently. "Harold, this affects you too. What do you think we should do?" The photographer was quiet for a long moment, his camera hanging forgotten around his neck. "Elizabeth, I've spent my career documenting human achievement. Every photograph I've taken has been about celebrating what people can accomplish when they push the boundaries of what's possible." He paused, looking around the chamber at the impossible technology that surrounded them. "But I've also learned that the most important photographs are the ones that tell the truth, even when the truth is difficult to accept. If this young man is telling us the truth about what happened to his timeline, then maybe the truth we need to tell is about the danger of pushing too far, too fast." Elizabeth nodded slowly, feeling the weight of cosmic responsibility settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. "David, if we help you complete the reset, how do we know it will work? How do we know we won't just be destroying your timeline for nothing?" David's face showed a mixture of hope and terror as he worked frantically at controls that were becoming increasingly unstable. Because the mathematics are precise, the temporal reset will restore the timeline to a stable configuration, but only if it's initiated properly. If I lose control of the process, the cascade effect will destroy everything anyway. Another violent shudder ran through the chamber, and Elizabeth could see that some of the temporal machinery was beginning to spark and smoke. Whatever window of opportunity they had was closing rapidly. "All right," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Tell us what we need to do." David's relief was visible even as he continued fighting to maintain control of systems that were clearly beyond their designed parameters. "I need you to help me recalibrate the temporal field generators. The process requires simultaneous adjustments at multiple points in the system, and I can't maintain stability while making the changes myself." He pointed to control stations positioned around the circular chamber. "Dr. Hartwell, you take the station at 2 o'clock. Harold, you take the one at 10 o'clock. When I give you the signal, you'll need to adjust the field harmonics to match the readings I call out." Elizabeth moved to her assigned position, her hands trembling as she approached controls that could reshape the fundamental nature of reality. "David, one more question. After the reset is complete, will we remember any of this?" David's expression became infinitely sad. "No. The reset will restore the timeline to July 1976, before the temporal cascade began. You'll have no memory of these events, no knowledge of the future I'm trying to prevent. Then how will we know to sabotage the space program achievements?" "You won't know," David admitted. "You'll have to trust that your instincts as educators and historians will guide you toward making choices that emphasize caution and responsibility over rapid technological advancement." Elizabeth realized the terrible irony of their situation. They were being asked to make a choice that they would never remember making, to prevent a future they would never know had been threatened. "Are you ready?" David called out, his voice barely audible over the sound of machinery that was rapidly approaching critical failure. Elizabeth looked at Harold, who nodded grimly from his position across the chamber. "We're ready," she replied, and placed her hands on controls that held the fate of the universe. The temporal machinery screamed with the sound of reality being torn apart and reassembled. Elizabeth's hands gripped the control station as David called out rapid-fire adjustments that she barely understood, her fingers moving across interfaces that responded to her touch with cascades of light and energy. "Field harmonics to 7.4!" David shouted over the increasing din. "Dr. Hartwell, rotate the primary resonance dial to match the blue indicator." Elizabeth found the dial he was referring to and turned it carefully, watching as readings across multiple displays shifted into alignment. The machinery's violent shaking smoothed slightly, but she could still see stress fractures spreading across the chamber walls. "Harold, I need you to initiate the cascade dampers." David's voice was becoming hoarse from shouting. "The red switches in sequence 1 through 7. Harold moved along his control panel, flipping switches with methodical precision despite the chaos around them. Each switch activation was accompanied by a deep harmonic tone that seemed to resonate through the building's foundation. The chamber filled with a strange aurora-like light as the temporal field generators began to synchronize. Elizabeth could see waves of distortion moving through the air itself, as if space was becoming fluid and reshaping itself according to forces that existed beyond normal physics. "It's working," David called out, though his expression remained tense with concentration. "But the field is still unstable. Dr. Hartwell, I need you to adjust the temporal anchor points, the circular controls at the bottom of your panel." Elizabeth found the controls he meant, a series of rotating dials that seemed to adjust the relationship between past, present, and future. As she moved them according to David's instructions, she could feel the chamber's relationship to time itself, shifting in ways that made her stomach lurch. Suddenly, the walls around them became transparent, revealing not the museum basement, but views of different time periods existing simultaneously. Elizabeth could see the construction of the museum in 1974, the opening day ceremonies just weeks ago, and glimpses of potential futures that flickered like television channels being rapidly changed. "Don't look directly at the temporal displays," David warned. "Human consciousness isn't equipped to process multiple timeline information simultaneously. Focus on your instruments." But Elizabeth found it impossible not to steal glances at the impossible visions surrounding them. In one direction, she could see Washington, D.C. as it had existed in the 1950s, when the original temporal research facility was being constructed. In another, she glimpsed a version of the city from decades in the future, with architecture and technology that looked both wondrous and somehow ominous. Most disturbing were the views that showed the catastrophic timeline David had described. Elizabeth caught glimpses of cities where buildings existed in multiple time periods simultaneously, where people aged and de-aged in endless loops, where the very fabric of reality had become unstable and unpredictable. "Field coherence at 60%, David reported. "Harold, I need you to engage the final sequence. The master control is the large lever on your right." Harold found the lever, a heavy mechanical device that looked more like something from a 1940s power plant than advanced temporal technology. "This one?" "Yes. Pull it down on my mark. Dr. Hartwell, when Harold engages the master control, you'll need to lock in the temporal coordinates. Set all your dials to the positions I'm about to call out." Elizabeth positioned her hands over the controls, waiting for David's instructions while trying not to look at the swirling visions of alternate timelines that surrounded them. "Temporal Anchor 1 set to 1976, 548, David called out. "Anchor 2, 1976, 549. Anchor 3, 1976, 550. Elizabeth adjusted the dials as quickly as she could, watching as the temporal field readings began to stabilize around the coordinates David was specifying. She realized he was setting the reset point to just after the museum's opening day, creating a narrow window where the timeline would be restored to a stable configuration. "Harold, now!" David shouted. Harold threw the master control lever with all his strength. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. The chamber filled with light so intense that Elizabeth had to close her eyes, and the sound of the machinery rose to a pitch that seemed to vibrate in her bones. Through closed eyelids, she could still see the light, and within that light, she began to see images from her own life playing backward. The past few hours in the chamber, then Harold's photographs, then the museum's opening day, then further back through months and years of her work at the Smithsonian. The reset is initiating. David's voice seemed to come from very far away, though he was only yards from her position. Dr. Hartwell, Harold, I need you to know something before we lose contact. Elizabeth tried to open her eyes, but the temporal light was too intense. What is it? The reset will erase your memories of these events, but it won't erase the intuitive knowledge you've gained. When you make decisions about the museum's future exhibits, when you choose how to present humanity's relationship with technology and space exploration, trust your instincts. They'll guide you toward choices that emphasize responsibility over rapid advancement. The light continued to intensify, and Elizabeth could feel her consciousness beginning to fragment as the timeline adjusted around her. David, what about you? What happens to you now? I fade away as my timeline is erased, he replied, and his voice was already becoming distant and echo-like. But knowing that the universe will be safe makes it worthwhile. Thank you both for helping me save everything that has ever existed or ever will exist. Elizabeth wanted to respond, wanted to tell him that his sacrifice would be remembered somehow, but she found that she could no longer form words. The temporal reset was affecting her ability to think coherently, as past and present realigned themselves around the new timeline configuration. The last thing she heard was David's voice, now barely a whisper across the dimensions of time. Remember to trust your instincts. The future depends on the choices you make without knowing why you're making them. Then the light became absolute, erasing everything Elizabeth thought she knew about reality, time, and the true purpose of the institution she had dedicated her life to protecting. The temporal reset reached its crescendo, and Elizabeth Hartwell, Harold Mitchell, and David Chen were swept away in a wave of reconfigured time that would restore the universe to a path where humanity's greatest achievements would never threaten the fundamental stability of existence itself. But the price of that safety would be choices made by people who would never know why they felt compelled to emphasize caution over ambition, responsibility over rapid technological advancement, and the long-term consequences of human actions over short-term achievements. The universe would be saved by decisions made in ignorance of the catastrophe they prevented. August 15, 1976. Elizabeth Hartwell stood in her office at the National Air and Space Museum, staring at a proposal for a new exhibit that should have excited her, but instead filled her with an inexplicable sense of unease. The document outlined plans for a display celebrating humanity's rapid advancement in space technology, emphasizing the limitless potential for exploration beyond Earth. Something about the proposal felt wrong, though she couldn't articulate why. Dr. Hartwell, her assistant knocked on the doorframe. Harold Mitchell is here with the final prints from opening day. He says there's something he wants to discuss with you. Elizabeth looked up from the troubling proposal. Send him in, please. Harold entered carrying a familiar manila envelope, but his expression was unusually subdued for someone delivering what should have been celebratory documentation of the museum's successful launch. Elizabeth, I've been going through all the photographs from opening day, he began, setting the envelope on her desk. Everything came out perfectly, technically speaking, but I keep having this strange feeling that I'm missing something important. Elizabeth opened the envelope and spread the prints across her desk. The images showed exactly what she expected. Crowds of visitors marveling at exhibits, children pressed against display cases, families learning about the history of human flight and space exploration. But as she studied the photographs, she felt the same inexplicable unease that had troubled her about the exhibit proposal. Something was missing from these images, though she couldn't identify what it might be. Harold, these are excellent documentation. What exactly is bothering you? Harold was quiet for a moment, studying the photographs alongside her. I keep feeling like there should be more pictures, like I photographed things that aren't in this collection. But that's impossible, right? I developed every frame on the rolls I shot that day. Elizabeth nodded, though privately she had been experiencing similar feelings of missing memories. Several times over the past few weeks, she had found herself in the museum basement, standing in storage areas with no clear recollection of why she had gone there. Maybe it's just the stress of opening such an important institution, she suggested. We've all been working incredibly hard. Maybe, Harold agreed, but his tone suggested he wasn't convinced. Elizabeth returned her attention to the exhibit proposal, reading through plans for displays that would showcase humanity's most ambitious space exploration goals. The document outlined exhibits featuring advanced propulsion systems, theoretical faster-than-light travel concepts, and speculative timelines for interstellar colonization. Harold, can I ask you something? As someone who documents human achievement, what's your opinion on how we should present humanity's future in space? Harold considered the question carefully. That's interesting timing. I've been thinking about that a lot lately. For some reason, I keep feeling like we should emphasize the importance of careful, methodical advancement, not rushing toward technologies we might not be ready for. Elizabeth looked up from the proposal. That's exactly how I've been feeling. This exhibit proposal should excite me. It represents everything we've worked toward in terms of inspiring public interest in space exploration. But instead, it makes me nervous. What kind of nervous? Like we might be encouraging people to move too fast, to push toward achievements that could have unintended consequences. Harold nodded thoughtfully. I've been having similar thoughts. When I look at these opening day photographs, I find myself wanting to emphasize the historical perspective more than the future potential, the careful progression of knowledge, the importance of understanding each step before taking the next one. Elizabeth set the proposal aside and pulled out her notes from recent meetings with the museum's board of directors. Harold, I think I'm going to recommend some changes to our long-term exhibition strategy. Instead of focusing so heavily on rapid advancement and limitless exploration, maybe we should emphasize sustainability, international cooperation, and careful consideration of the long-term implications of new technologies. That sounds right, Harold agreed, though I'm not sure I could explain why it sounds right. Elizabeth stood and walked to her office window, looking out at the Washington D.C. skyline. The summer heat created shimmers in the air that reminded her, for reasons she couldn't explain, of distortions in space and time. Harold, I want to ask you to do something that might seem unusual. When you're documenting future exhibits, I want you to pay special attention to how we present the relationship between human ambition and technological responsibility. I have a feeling that the stories we tell here will influence how future generations think about exploration and discovery. You want me to emphasize caution over excitement? Not caution exactly, more like wisdom. The importance of understanding the full implications of our actions before we commit to paths we might not be able to change. Harold gathered his photographs from Elizabeth's desk. I'll do that. And Elizabeth, if you don't mind me saying, it feels like we're remembering something important, even though we can't remember what it is. After Harold left, Elizabeth returned to the exhibit proposal, but instead of reviewing it for approval, she began drafting a counter-proposal. Her alternative emphasized the historical progression of human flight, the lessons learned from both successes and failures, and the importance of international cooperation in space exploration. Most importantly, her revision included strong warnings about the potential dangers of advancing too rapidly toward technologies that humanity might not be psychologically or ethically prepared to handle. As she wrote, Elizabeth found herself including specific cautions about temporal mechanics and faster-than-light travel, though she had no conscious knowledge of why such topics seemed so important to address. The words flowed from her pen as if she were remembering rather than creating, drawing from knowledge she didn't realize she possessed about the crucial importance of maintaining humanity's careful, methodical approach to exploring the cosmos. When she finished, Elizabeth looked at what she had written and realized that she had outlined a completely different vision for the museum's future. Instead of celebrating humanity's unlimited potential for rapid expansion into space, her proposal emphasized sustainability, responsibility, and the critical importance of understanding the long-term consequences of technological advancement. The proposal felt right in ways that she couldn't explain, as if she were fulfilling a promise she had made to someone she couldn't remember, to prevent a catastrophe she had never witnessed. Elizabeth sealed the counter-proposal in an envelope and placed it in her outgoing mail. Tomorrow she would present it to the board of directors as her official recommendation for the museum's long-term exhibition strategy. She had no way of knowing that her unconscious decisions would help guide humanity away from the temporal research that could have destroyed the universe, or that her careful emphasis on responsible technological development would influence generations of scientists and policymakers to choose sustainable exploration over rapid advancement toward catastrophic discoveries. The reset had worked perfectly, erasing the memories while preserving the intuitive wisdom needed to protect reality itself from humanity's most dangerous ambitions. October 1976. The first autumn leaves were beginning to fall on the National Mall as Elizabeth Hartwell walked through the museum's exhibits during the quiet hour before opening. Her revised exhibition strategy had been approved by the board, and the changes were already beginning to take shape throughout the galleries. But this morning, something felt different. As Elizabeth passed the flight suit display, she noticed that one of the cases seemed to catch the early morning light in an unusual way. She approached for a closer look and found herself staring at her own reflection in the glass, superimposed over the historical aviation equipment inside. For just a moment, the reflection seemed wrong. Instead of her own face, she could have sworn she saw a young boy looking back at her, his expression filled with sadness and gratitude. Elizabeth blinked, and her normal reflection returned, but the image left her with a profound sense of loss for something she couldn't identify. "Dr. Hartwell," Officer Thompson's voice interrupted her contemplation. "I wanted to thank you for the changes you've been making to the exhibits." Elizabeth turned to face the young security guard. Over the past few months, Thompson had become one of her most valuable sources of visitor feedback, seeming to have an intuitive understanding of how the exhibits affected people. "What do you mean?" "The new emphasis on careful development, international cooperation, responsible exploration. I've been watching how visitors respond to the updated displays, and there's something different about the way they engage with the material now." Elizabeth was intrigued. "Different how?" Thompson thought for a moment. "Before, people seemed excited but also somehow anxious when they looked at the space exploration exhibits, like they were worried about something they couldn't name. Now they seem more thoughtful, more focused on understanding rather than just being amazed." As they talked, Elizabeth noticed Harold Mitchell approaching with his camera equipment. He had been documenting the exhibit changes for the museum's archives, but his photography style had evolved over the past few months in ways that surprised her. "Morning, Elizabeth Thompson," Harold said as he joined them. "I wanted to show you something interesting I discovered while reviewing my recent photographs." Harold opened a portfolio containing prints from his documentation of the revised exhibits. "Look at these images of visitors interacting with the displays. Notice anything unusual?" Elizabeth studied the photographs carefully. The images showed families and children engaging with the exhibits, but there was something subtly different about their expressions compared to Harold's opening day photos. "They look more contemplative," she observed, "less focused on the excitement of achievement, more interested in understanding the process and implications." "Exactly," Harold agreed. "And here's what's really interesting. I've been comparing these recent photos with my opening day shots, and I keep feeling like there's a narrative thread connecting them, like the museum is telling a different story now, one that emphasizes wisdom over ambition." Thompson nodded. "I've noticed something similar. Sometimes when I'm doing security rounds at night, I feel like I'm not alone in the galleries. Not in a scary way, but like there's a presence that approves of the changes we've made." Elizabeth felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. "A presence. It's hard to explain," Thompson continued. "Sometimes I think I glimpse a figure near the exhibits, usually a young person, but when I look directly, there's nobody there. It feels benevolent, though, like someone who cares about the museum is making sure we're on the right track." Harold was quiet for a moment, studying his photographs. "Thompson, you just gave me an idea. Elizabeth, would you mind if I tried an experiment? I want to photograph the exhibits during different lighting conditions to see if I can capture whatever Thompson is sensing." "That sounds fine. But what kind of experiment?" "I want to take long exposure shots during the evening hours when the museum is closed and the lighting is minimal. Sometimes photographic film can record things that human eyes miss." Elizabeth found herself nodding agreement, though she wasn't sure why the experiment felt important. "Go ahead, Harold. Just coordinate with security so they know you'll be in the building after hours." That evening, Harold returned to the museum with specialized low-light photography equipment. Thompson accompanied him on his rounds, helping to identify the locations where the mysterious presence seemed strongest. They began in the flight suit exhibit, where Thompson reported the most frequent sightings. Harold set up his camera for a 5-minute exposure, using the minimal emergency lighting to create atmospheric images of the displays. As the exposure progressed, both men found themselves staring at the sealed display case that contained the historical aviation equipment. The longer they looked, the more certain they became that something was moving within the case, though the movement was too subtle to identify clearly. "Harold, are you seeing what I'm seeing?" "I'm not sure what I'm seeing," Harold replied honestly, "but something is definitely happening." When the exposure was complete, Harold made several more long-exposure photographs throughout the museum, focusing on exhibits that dealt with advanced propulsion systems, space exploration technology, and theoretical physics displays. The next morning, Harold developed the film in his darkroom with unusual care, extending the processing time and using enhanced contrast techniques to bring out details that might not be visible in standard prints. What he found left him staring at the photographs in amazement and confusion. In every long exposure image, there were figures that didn't appear to be quite solid, but were definitely present. Most prominent was a young boy, perhaps 8 years old, who appeared near several different exhibits. But there were others as well. What looked like an older teenager working at control panels that didn't exist in the actual displays, and a woman who resembled Elizabeth standing in locations throughout the museum. The figures appeared to be interacting with technology that was far more advanced than anything in the actual exhibits. In one photograph, the boy seemed to be studying what looked like a sophisticated flight suit that shimmered with its own inner light. In another, the teenager appeared to be operating equipment that looked decades ahead of 1976 technology. Most unsettling was an image that showed Elizabeth herself standing in what appeared to be an underground chamber filled with impossible machinery, her hands positioned as if she were operating controls that existed in multiple time periods. Simultaneously, Harold made multiple prints of each photograph, trying different exposure times and contrast settings, but the results remained consistent. The figures were there, solid enough to register on photographic film, but existing in some state that normal human vision couldn't detect. When Harold showed the photographs to Elizabeth and Thompson the next day, all three found themselves staring at evidence of something that challenged their understanding of reality. "These people," Elizabeth said quietly, studying the image that showed her underground counterpart, "it's like they're memories of events that never happened but somehow still exist. Or maybe," Thompson suggested, "they're the ghosts of a timeline that was erased, still trying to make sure their sacrifice wasn't in vain." Harold looked at the photograph showing the young boy examining advanced technology that didn't belong in their exhibits. If that's true, then our instincts about emphasizing responsible development aren't just good museum practice. They're honoring the wishes of people who gave up their entire existence to protect ours. Elizabeth felt tears forming in her eyes, though she couldn't explain why. The faces in Harold's photographs seemed familiar in ways that tugged at memories she didn't possess, reminders of crucial knowledge that had been erased to save the universe from consequences too terrible to remember. "We need to continue the work we've started," she said finally. "Whatever these images represent, whoever these people were, they trusted us to make the right choices about how humanity approaches its future in space." None of them could have known that the boy in the photographs was David Chen, still maintaining a ghostly vigil over the timeline he had died to protect, ensuring that the intuitive wisdom planted in their unconscious minds would guide humanity away from the catastrophic path that had once seemed so promising. December 1976. Snow fell gently on Washington, D.C. as Elizabeth Hartwell prepared for her final meeting of the year with the museum's board of directors. In her briefcase, she carried a comprehensive report documenting the success of the revised exhibition strategy, along with Harold's extraordinary photographs that captured evidence of presences that shouldn't exist. The past 6 months had transformed not just the museum's approach to presenting human achievement in space, but Elizabeth's understanding of her role as a guardian of humanity's future. The intuitive knowledge that guided her decisions had grown stronger over time, as if unseen advisors were helping her refine the delicate balance between inspiration and caution. Harold knocked on her office door, carrying a final portfolio of documentation photographs. "Elizabeth, I wanted to show you something before your board meeting. I think you'll find it encouraging." He spread the prints across her desk, showing images of visitors throughout the autumn months. The photographs revealed a subtle but significant change in how people interacted with the exhibits. Children still showed wonder and excitement, but their engagement had a more thoughtful quality. Adults spent more time reading the detailed explanations about the long-term implications of technological advancement. "Look at this series." Harold pointed to photographs showing a family at the space exploration exhibit. "The parents are discussing not just what humanity has achieved, but what responsibilities come with those achievements. The children are asking questions about sustainability and international cooperation." Elizabeth studied the images with satisfaction. "The message is getting through. We're inspiring people to think beyond immediate excitement about technological possibilities. And there's something else," Harold continued, his voice dropping to a more serious tone. "The presences I've been photographing, The figures that appear in the long exposure shots, they've been changing. Harold pulled out a recent photograph taken the previous week. In the image, the young boy who had appeared so frequently throughout the autumn was no longer alone. Around him stood what appeared to be dozens of other figures, men and women of various ages, all seeming to observe the museum's visitors with expressions of approval and gratitude. It's like they're not just individual ghosts, Harold explained. They're representatives of entire generations who were saved by the timeline reset. People who never existed because the catastrophic future was prevented, but who somehow still exist as witnesses to ensure the protection holds. Elizabeth felt the familiar sensation of remembering something she had never experienced. Harold, I think these figures are confirmation that we're fulfilling our purpose. Whatever happened in the erased timeline, whoever made the sacrifice to reset reality, they're still watching to make sure humanity stays on a safer path. As if summoned by her words, Officer Thompson appeared in the doorway. Dr. Hartwell, I wanted to report something before you leave for your meeting. Last night during my rounds, I had the clearest encounter yet with our mysterious presence. What happened? Thompson entered the office, his expression showing wonder rather than fear. I was checking the flight suit exhibit around midnight when I saw the boy again, but this time he was clearly visible, not just a glimpse or a feeling. He looked directly at me and spoke. Elizabeth and Harold exchanged glances. What did he say? He said, "Thank you for keeping the promise. The universe is safe because of choices made by people who will never know what they prevented." Thompson paused, collecting his thoughts. Then he smiled, and I had the strangest feeling that he was saying goodbye. Harold pulled out his most recent long-exposure photograph, taken just days earlier. Unlike previous images that showed multiple ghostly figures throughout the museum, this one showed the young boy standing alone in the main gallery, his hand raised in what appeared to be a farewell gesture. "I think his vigil is ending," Harold said quietly. "The timeline is stable enough now that he doesn't need to maintain his watch. The changes we've implemented, the shift in how people think about space exploration and technological advancement, they've become self-sustaining." Elizabeth looked at the photographs spread across her desk, each one documenting humanity's gradual embrace of responsible exploration over reckless ambition. The boy's mission was complete. "Thompson, Harold, I want you both to know how proud I am of the work we've done together. We may never fully understand why we felt compelled to emphasize caution and responsibility, but the results speak for themselves." She gathered her materials for the board meeting, including a proposal that would establish the museum as a center for studying the ethical implications of advanced technology. "I'm going to recommend that we create a permanent advisory committee focused on the long-term consequences of human exploration and development. We'll call it the Temporal Responsibility Initiative." The name felt right, though Elizabeth couldn't explain why. At the board meeting that afternoon, Elizabeth presented her comprehensive report on the museum's evolution over its first 6 months. The statistical evidence was overwhelming. Visitor engagement had deepened, educational impact had increased, and the museum's influence on public policy discussions about space exploration had grown significantly. "Most importantly," she concluded her presentation, "we've established this museum as more than just a celebration of human achievement. We've made it a place where people learn to think carefully about the implications of progress, where excitement about technological possibilities is balanced with wisdom about responsible development." The board approved all of her recommendations, including the establishment of the Temporal Responsibility Initiative and increased funding for educational programs that emphasized sustainable exploration and international cooperation. As Elizabeth walked back to her office through the December snow, she felt a profound sense of completion, as if a long and difficult task had finally been finished successfully. That evening, Harold took one final long-exposure photograph in the main gallery. When he developed it the next morning, the image showed empty exhibits with no trace of the ghostly figures that had appeared in hundreds of previous shots. The boy and his companions were gone, their mission accomplished. But their legacy remained in every decision Elizabeth would make about the museum's future, in every photograph Harold would take that emphasized wisdom over ambition, in every security report Thompson would file that prioritized long-term safety over short-term excitement. The universe had been saved by people who would never know what they had prevented, guided by the ghost of a boy who had sacrificed his entire timeline to ensure that humanity would choose responsibility over catastrophic achievement. In the decades that followed, the National Air and Space Museum would become renowned not just for celebrating human accomplishment, but for fostering the kind of careful, thoughtful approach to exploration that would guide humanity safely through the challenges of the space age. The boy named David Chen, who had never existed but had saved everything that did exist, could finally rest in the knowledge that his sacrifice had created a timeline where humanity's greatest achievements would never threaten the fundamental stability of reality itself. The temporal guardian's watch was ended, the universe was safe, and in a small display case in the museum's main gallery, a single photograph remained, as the only evidence of the impossible events of 1976, an image of a young boy standing where no boy could be, forever watching over the future he had died to protect.